So first of all, thank you for inviting me. Today, as was said, I'm going to talk about virtual reality, in particular virtual reality in psychotherapy. And I'm going to introduce a particular technique that we developed called Converse Self, Conversations with Yourself in Virtual Reality. So my talk is going to be in key illusions of virtual reality, then virtual reality in mental health, then virtual embodiment, self-counseling, and then some conclusions. So the key illusions, there's three key illusions of virtual reality. And the first one I call place illusion. And this is the illusion that I am here in the world depicted by the virtual reality. I'm not in the real world, but I'm in the virtual reality world. And this is caused by sensory motor contingencies, which operate much like in everyday life. So you turn your head, you bend down, you look around things, you use your body to perceive much as you do in physical reality. And this gives the brain the illusion that you're in the virtual world. The second illusion I call plausibility. This is this is based on three aspects. One, the virtual world is responsive to you. For example, you smile at a virtual human character and it smiles back to you. The second one is something personal in the world. For example, virtual characters look at you, or virtual people pass you when they're walking and they make way for you. And the last one, which is the most difficult, because the first two are just a matter of programming. The last one I call congruent, which is that when the virtual world depicts something, if you're an expert in that area, there are things that have to be right. Otherwise, you reject the experience. And they could be very tiny things. I'll give an example later. The last illusion I call body ownership. In virtual reality, when you look down towards yourself or in a mirror, you can see a virtual body that's life's your own. Back to the detail later, but this is based on multisensory integration where, for example, you move and the body moves, the virtual body moves the same as you do. So place illusion is a perceptual illusion. If for some reason it breaks, it comes back again, it reforms. The plausibility illusion is more of a cognitive illusion. If it breaks, you lose interest and it doesn't come back again. You don't get this illusion again. And the last one is a perceptual illusion. Again, this is persistent. If it breaks, it comes back again. So my thesis is that these two things together, place illusion, pi, and plausibility, psi, lead to realistic responses to situations in events in the virtual world. So, for example, by realistic responses to situation in events, I mean that you respond appropriately at the physiological, behavioral. So, for example, when people go into this virtual world, which depicts a room with a big pit, a big hole in the ground that is 18 meters below, they get anxious. And this is, in a way, it's crazy because there's nothing there. There's just some pixels on a screen. But nevertheless, the place illusion and the plausibility lead to appropriate responses. So I have a strong view of place illusion. This is the illusion that you're in the virtual place, in spite of the fact of course, you know you're not there. You know you're wearing a head-mounted display. You're in an ordinary place, but you know it's not true, but nevertheless, you have this strong illusion. And this shouldn't be confused with many different interpretations of this idea of presence, which are things like attention, interest, flow, task performance. This is a separate illusion, the illusion of being in the place. Now, this definition of place illusion is not applicable to our normal everyday experiences. The fact that it occurs is witnessed by the surprise that people have when they enter virtual reality. And then after this initial surprise, they kind of adjust their perceptual apparatus so that the world makes sense. And when I say surprise, I mean it in two ways. It's a perceptual shock, and it's also a surprise in the technical meaning as entropy. We need to minimize surprise to be able to function in a world, and in particular in the virtual world, we need our perceptual system to stabilize, and so that we can understand what's going on. And here's an example of an experiment we did many years ago. In this experiment, participants experienced a virtual reality that gradually formed. So what happened is polygons were appearing, and triangles were appearing in the world at random, and after a while, the world formed into one of three different things. In one condition, it was a stress-inducing world where participants realized they were standing on top of a column very high. There was a second environment, which I call the non-stress one, where participants were in the same environment, but they were at ground level. They weren't high up. The third one, it just stayed random. The polygons were there, but they were all rotated randomly. The world never made any sense. And we had two measurements. One was the head gaze direction entropy, which is the amount of randomness there were in your gaze direction. And the second one is skin conductance responses, which measure the degree of arousal. And what happened was very interesting. In this graph, the solid line is the scan path, the head scan path entropy. You can see at first it goes very high because people are looking around. The world looks random. They don't know where to look. But after a while, it forms and the entropy drops. And then it kind of stabilizes as they start looking around again. And if you look at the same time that the entropy starts to go down, the skin conductance, the arousal starts to go up. This is in the stress-inducing condition, where suddenly they realize they're standing very high on top of a pillar. So at the same time that the world form became something that they could comprehend, their perceptual system settled down and they understood it, that's when they got the arousal. However, in the no stress condition, we see the same pattern for the scan path entropy. At first, the world is random. They're moving their head around a lot, then it stabilized. But if you look at the skin conductance, the arousal, it more or less correlates with that. There was no special arousal that was caused by like in the first stress producing one. So this presence, it's a real thing. It really happens. And this is like some nice objective evidence about that. We can look at this further because there's a clear negative correlation between the level of arousal, the skin conductance responses, and the scan path entropy. Plausibility is rather more difficult. As I said, you can get place illusion by simply having appropriate affordances for perception in the virtual world, like in the real world. But plausibility is much more difficult and much less understood. Plausibility is the illusion that the events happening are real. So we did an experiment with medical doctors that illustrated one failure of plausibility. So the doctors interacted with virtual patients who unreasonably demanded antibiotics. The doctors became quite stressed dealing with these virtual patients. The more experienced doctors were less inclined to prescribe antibiotics, and the more junior doctors usually gave in and prescribed the antibiotics. But what was interesting was one failure of plausibility. If you've been to a doctor these days, they usually don't look at you very much. They look at their computers on the screen. And in our virtual world, we couldn't have a virtual computer on the screen because it doesn't have the resolution that we needed. So many of the doctors complained that this brought them out of the experience. So plausibility is an exceedingly complex topic. And it doesn't mean realism. It means, for example, small items that you expect to be there. If they're not there, if they don't work, then you lose plausibility. Here's an example of how complex it is. This is an example from Fear of Heights, an experiment we did to look at cognitive behavioral therapy for fear of heights. And participants were on top of a tall building, and there's a whale swimming in the middle of the atrium. And nobody said, oh, this is ridiculous, it doesn't work. They just accepted it. So why do they accept this? But they don't accept like a small item missing, like the computer in the doctor's experiment. So it's a very complex subject. So I'm going to talk now about virtual reality, and obviously it relies on this sense of presence, this place illusion and plausibility. Virtual reality is probably the widest used application of virtual reality in the last 30 years. It's typically used as part of conventional treatment. It obviously has economic and logistic advantages. If someone has fear of heights, they can experience fear of heights in a doctor's office. They don't actually have to go to a real building. And it's used most often with cognitive behavioral therapy, where you expose people to the feared situation. They've got to get some degree of anxiety and their beliefs are challenged and reframed. So can virtual reality be used to trigger the anxiety? So the evidence strongly suggests that yes, people will have anxiety in response to a virtual precipice, fear of heights, for example. People with fear of public speaking also have fear of public speaking in front of a virtual audience. People with paranoia will become paranoid even with virtual people. So here's an example of fear of heights. In this experiment done by Meehan, again, it's a long time, nearly 20 years ago, participants had to go into the second room through the door and find their way to the chair on the other side. And most people exhibited a strong anxiety, an increase in heart rate. And if also when they stepped on the ledge, they felt it on their real feet, because they were standing on a little platform which they didn't know about, then the heart rate went up even more. For social phobia, exposure therapy using virtual reality is usually been done in the domain of public speaking, and there's many papers. I've sent these slides to the organizers so you can look up some of these. Here's one again we did around 20 years ago. This is people wearing a head-mounted display speaking to a very positive audience. So whatever you do, they're smiling, they're nodding, they're very happy. It's very easy to talk to this audience. Now compare it with this audience. This is really hard to talk to this audience. Even experienced speakers couldn't talk to this audience. In spite of the fact it doesn't look very real, it's very like a cartoon. People have this illusion of presence, the plausibility and place illusion, and they respond appropriately with anxiety. On psychotic disorders, there's been a lot of work over the past 20 years led by Daniel Freeman of Oxford. This also includes realities usually used as an extra. It's not an intrinsic part of the therapy, but is used as the method of exposure in exposure therapy. So it requires the real therapist. All the studies show that it's at least as beneficial in outcome to traditional methods. And there's a recent meta-study that reaches these conclusions. Again, in the slides I've sent to the organizers, this link activates and it takes you to the actual paper. Now I'm going to move on to the third illusion I mentioned, which is the main part of my talk, which is a body ownership illusion. And first of all, I'm going to explain what a body ownership illusion is. It usually occurs when there's multisensory data that involves a contradiction that the brain resolves by producing the illusion. So this one is called the Pinocchio illusion by Lechner, 1988. So in this experiment, the subject is the one sitting behind, he has his eyes closed. And the one sitting in front, only he's needed for his nose. And the experimenter taps the nose of the subject and moves the finger of the subject to tap the nose of the one in front. And this tapping is synchronous, which is very important. So from the point of view of the subject, it's okay. He's feeling his nose being touched and he's touching a nose with his finger. And the brain makes these into one percept. It combines them into one percept. I'm touching my nose. But it doesn't make sense because your arm is outstretched. So how does the brain solve this? It's impossible for me to describe this. You have to experience it. It gives you this illusion that your nose has grown very long. So this is a very well-known illusion in cognitive neuroscience. And another even more well-known one is called the rubber hand illusion. I'll show you this with a video. So what's happening here is the left hand is a rubber hand and the right hand is the subject's real hand, which is out of sight. The experimenter is tapping both hands synchronously. And what happens is that after a while, the feeling of proprioception passes to the rubber hand. And if you attack the rubber hand, people respond very strongly. So it's a very strong illusion. In virtual reality, we do this a slightly different way. Typically, we use not visual tactile, but visual motor integration. You look down, you see a body substituting your own, which is life size. You move and the body moves with you. You see it move. And also you see it move in a mirror. And typically people get a very strong illusion that the virtual body is their body. Of course, they know it's not their body. It may look quite different, but it's a very strong perceptual illusion, which is you get rid of the illusion by closing your eyes. So there's many papers that have shown that this illusion works in virtual reality. And what's even more interesting is that when you change the body, you change aspects of the mind. So actually, if you embody white people in a black body, their racial bias decreases. You put adults in a child body, they become more childlike. I'll just mention one more. If you put people in the body of Albert Einstein, they do better on a cognitive test than if you put them in another more ordinary body. So when you change the body in virtual reality, it has big effects. Even it can result in pain reduction, depending on the aspects of your body. So now I'll come on to the idea of self-counseling, which uses this idea of body ownership. So the basic idea of this self-counseling is that we're typically much better at giving advice to a friend rather than to ourselves. So even though we talk to ourselves a lot continuously on the inside, probably all of us are doing it right now, saying things to ourselves on the inside. And typically when you talk to yourself on the inside, you can't get out of your own way of thinking. If you have a problem, you can't get out of it because you have a particular way of thinking. But if you're talking to a friend, usually you can see another side to their story and help them. Now, suppose you could objectify the you that you talk to when you talk with yourself. Maybe talking with yourself as if you were another person would be helpful for solving your personal problems. So that the starting point of this idea is that we can make a scan of your real body and then put that body in virtual reality with you inside it. And also in virtual reality, we can embody you as anybody. Like I was saying before, a white person in a black body or an adult in a child body, we can embody you as anybody. So for example, we could embody you as Sigmund Freud. When you look in the mirror, you don't see yourself, but you see Sigmund Freud staring back. So in the first experiment we did, first of all, we embodied the subject who's on the left here in their real body, in a likeness of their own body. And they explained a problem to Sigmund Freud. And then they became Sigmund Freud. They were in Freud's body and they saw and heard themselves describe that problem. Then as Freud, they could give back an answer. Remember, the type of body you have affects how you are. It affects your attitudes, behaviors, and so on. So then they could keep switching back and forward, having this conversation with themselves. So in our first experiment, the participants discussed personal problems with the counselor, who was Freud, and in general, all participants improved. But if they're embodied as Freud as the counselor, they improve more than when embodied as another copy of themselves. And if the counselor body moves synchronously with their own movements, in other words, they get strong body ownership, then they improve even more. Embodied Freud with the body moves like you move led to the best results. So we did a more recent study where we asked, is it the body swapping here that's important, or do people improve simply because they talk about their problem? So we had an experiment with two conditions. In the experimental condition, they swapped bodies with Freud, just like I said. And in another condition, they spoke to a pre-programmed animated Freud who asked the participant questions, but there was no body swapping. So the sequence of events was, first of all, they met a psychologist for a screening. Then they met the psychologist before the virtual reality to frame the problem. Then after the virtual reality, we took some measurements. Then we took some more measurements after 1 week. And in all the conditions, the body ownership was high. Whether they were embodied with their own body or with Freud, it made no difference. First of all, we scan the person. to get a likeness of themselves, and what you end up with is a virtual copy.
Okay, so what is the problem you'd like to talk about today?
My problem is that I'd like to take better care of my health. That usually I'm sitting for 8 hours in my job at work and I don't get any exercise, and I feel like I should maybe do something about that.
Okay.
Raise your right hand. Now look in the mirror to your left. When the light next to you turns green, explain the problem to the person in front of you.
So when I notice that I'm delaying going to the gym after I come back from work, I think that I should go because I want to take care of my health.
Now listen to the person in front of you, and when the light next to you turns green, reply and try to help them find a solution.
So when I notice that I am delaying going to the gym after I come back from work, what seems to be the problem?
Why do you think that you delay? Why do you think that you're not going? What seems to be the problem? What seems to be stopping you?
So that's the idea. The video just carries on. They keep swapping bodies all the time, from time to time, having a conversation with themselves. And here's part of the results. The results are actually quite long. It's published in a paper. But for example, through this technique, people in the experimental condition where they swapped bodies with Freud, they got better knowledge about their problem, better understanding, they got new ideas, better control, and it helped them. And what was interesting is we also measured prior to the VR, after the VR, after one. Of course, prior to the VR, there's no difference between the control and the experimental group. But after the VR, there's a big difference. Those in the experimental group, more than 80% of them reported a positive change. And that lasted at least for 1 week. We don't know if it lasted longer. We couldn't continue with the experiment, but these were encouraging results. This was a journalist from The Guardian tried this, the Guardian newspaper in England. He tried this, and he had a very interesting experience where he said, now I switch roles and I'm Freud advising me. The first time I do it, I'm too self-conscious. Slater gently suggests that I was not fully immersed. I ask if I can do it again. This time I go for it. It might not be the way Freud would have responded, but I listen to my problems and I tear into myself rightly or wrongly. And the rubbish. I verbalize everything and dismiss it as solipsistic nonsense. I then return to my own avatar. Good points, well made, I say to Freud, and I meant it. This is somebody, again, a journalist from the New Yorker magazine, who spoke about some guilt he had in his mother was far away from him, and he said, soon I fell into a rhythm. Freud and I talked for about 20 minutes. He was insightful. He said, remember, it's himself talking. He was insightful. He said things I'd never said to my very life. When I took off the headset, I was moved. I wanted to tell myself, good talk. From his perspective, I'd seemed different, sadder, more ordinary, incomprehensible. I told myself to remember that version of me. So you see yourself as another person from the outside. Similarly, and in the end, She said, after a half an hour of swapping bodies, I finally ran out of questions. I thanked Freud for his help and took off my headset. That evening, I write my friend an upbeat, supportive note. He responds soon after with a phone call, and we have a fun, drama-free chat. And she got more empathy for his situation. Again, she saw herself from the outside and could see solutions that she couldn't see as herself. So my overall conclusions: presence, place illusion, and plausibility are unique illusions that can be generated in immersive systems. And due to those, people respond realistically. So that's why there's been a huge application of virtual reality in psychotherapy in the last 3 decades. My own interest, the virtual as a therapy is all the same, but they use virtual reality for the exposure part of it. But my interest in virtual reality has always been to go beyond using it simply as a simulation of reality, because in virtual reality, we can have impossible but real beneficial experiences. And I'm putting forward the idea that this conversation with yourself in virtual reality is an example. Those of you who know, it's a bit similar to the empty chair technique from Gestalt therapy. In the empty chair technique, you have to imagine somebody on the other chair, but here you don't have to imagine, you actually experience it. So I'd like to thank all the various people in my lab who've contributed towards this work. And all the work has been funded by the European Union in research.